Hello. Well, there isn't much point in talking about Brexit right now. The situation is changing from day to day. A friend of mine who's travelling abroad is worried that she won't be able to get back into the country on her EU passport when she comes home. Everyone's in a state of of nervous anticipation one way or the other. And I'm worried about the deal that Johnson's going to make, or the deal that Johnson's going to make. And I'm both heartbroken and furious about the treacherous behaviour. And no, there's no other way to put it. The treacherous behaviour of the people who are colluding with a foreign government against the stated wishes of the British people. That's definitely treachery. But I suppose, like the traitors who acted as spies for Russia in the mid-20th century, who also were upper-class types, interestingly enough, those people then and these people now are probably convincing themselves that they're doing this for our own good. I just hope we can get through it. Anyway, I thought perhaps a diversion would be appropriate while we're waiting, and this video is going to be about transgenderism. And I'm going to bring into it the story of the famous case of the Chevalier to illustrate. There've always been people, men and women, who've fallen between the genders, historically. Sometimes they found a niche for themselves, and sometimes they were dreadfully persecuted. And in many cases, the reasons have often arisen from different motives with regard to men and women. Women who dressed as men, it was quite commonly known about this habit of women dressing as men. And they were doing it to travel unaccompanied or to seek adventure by enlisting in the military. There's a woman called Hannah Snell who actually disguised herself as a man. And then there are people like Joanna of Flanders who wore men's clothes while she commanded her husband's army after he was captured by the enemy. Obviously, wearing men's clothes when you're commanding an army, it's like wearing a uniform. Somebody in women's clothes wouldn't be approached with the same respect by the soldiers. Oh, by the way, Joanna of Flanders was in the early 14th century. Hannah Snell was actually an 18th century lady. I forgot to say that. There are one or two highwaymen who turned out to be highway women, and there must be many more that we don't know about. That is, they spent time as soldiers or highwaymen or whatever, and then they just slipped away and resumed their lives as women later on. Also, there were certainly gay women who dressed as men, but just as many gay women kept on being dressed as women. From what I've read about cross-dressers among women, they weren't actually gay. They just wanted the sort of freedom and adventure which was afforded to men and forbidden, or even very dangerous, for women to adopt. In the case of men dressing as women, the situation is far more complicated, because when a man took on a female persona up to about, 60 years ago or so, even less, 50 years maybe, when a man took on a female persona, he was definitely stepping down into a much narrower and subordinate position in society. So in general, when a man took on women's dress, he was obviously suffering from a true psychological problem. Not necessarily gender dysphoria either, by the way, but definitely some inability to accept his role as a man. Because we have to remember that although women were dreadfully persecuted by the legal system, men were just as persecuted in a different way. They were frequently imposed upon with far more responsibility and blame than they have now with regard to the women folk for whom they were seen to be responsible. For instance, anyone who's read Charles Dickens' Oliver Twist will remember Mr. Bumble, the beadle of the poorhouse, which is Oliver's home for the first few years of his life. Bumble marries the matron of the poorhouse, Mrs. Corney, and then finds that he's held responsible for her criminal activity because, it is explained to him, a wife is considered to be acting on the instruction of her husband, at which point Mr. Bumble explodes. If the law supposes that, the law is a ass, and if that's the eye of the law is a bachelor. And if you remember, everyone knows about Pride and Prejudice now, and the single most important thread running through the whole novel was that Longbourn House, where the Bennet family lived, would pass upon the death of Mr. Bennet not to the girls, but to the dreadful Mr. Collins, Mr. Bennet's cousin. It's true that thereafter Mr. Collins would be expected to set the ladies up in a little place on the estate and maintain them. However, we all know that Collins is an egotistical hypocrite, and any maintenance he would give to the Bennet women would be spiteful, grudging, and probably parsimonious. That's why at least one of the girls has to marry a rich man who will then become responsible for her sisters and her mother. So it could be understandable if a man would choose to step down into the status of a woman without actually being gay, just wishing to lose all that social responsibility. I'm put in mind of a quote from a novel called The Good Soldier by Ford Madox Ford. I don't have it in front of me now, but it goes something like, he's talking about the problems of being a man of a certain social standing who's expected to eat roast beef and drink whiskey. And he says it's really terrible to have to eat thin slices of pink India rubber and, instead of like sort of little creamed chicken or whatever. And it's disagreeable to have to drink brandy. I remember him saying that, when you would prefer warm, sweet Kummel to be comforted by. Oh, and it's dreadful to have to take a cold bath in the morning instead of a nice hot bath at night. I'll find the quote and I'll put it up at the side here. I think it'll be that side anyway. And of course, there is also the colourful transvestite, the Chevalier d'Eon. Now, there was a character, a man who was a decorated soldier and a diplomat. And at a certain point in his life, when he was in the British court, I think, suddenly told everyone that he was really a woman. And he said he'd been dressed as a boy and brought up as a boy by his father because his father needed a male heir to secure the inheritance. After that, he then adopted women's clothes and lived the rest of his life as a woman. Not as a lady, I might say, because by all accounts he acted in a very masculine way, hitching up his skirts to go up and down stairs and speaking in a very coarse language. Also, when he was not being a diplomat, which he still was, even when he adopted the dress of a woman, he earned a living as a fencing mistress, but he fought only men. I don't know whether he actually taught women fencing. He might have done, but he competed only against men. He never took advantage of his adopted femininity. There was a lot of discussion at the time about exactly what he was, with some believing he really was female, while others believed that he was not. After he died, a lot of very interesting people got to find out, and it was ascertained that he was a fully functioning man. But this isn't the way modern transvestism works. Men who dress as women and say they are women, even though they've not had any medical intervention, are, in my opinion, not transgender. But in my opinion, they're simply transvestite. And there's nothing wrong with that, just so long as they stick to their sphere. Unfortunately, many of them do not. And there's a considerable characteristic of much modern transgenderism, which is plain and simple the abuse of women. I'm talking about men who say they identify as women and who participate in female athletic competitions and beat the hell out of the female athletes who, with certain notable exceptions, don't have a hope of winning. Not when they're facing men in any athletic competition. Mostly. There's one instance that I can think of where women and men can compete on a level platform, and that's horse riding. When you're on board a horse, one gender is as strong as the other. And strangely enough, although there are plenty of gay men who ride horses in competitions, I haven't heard of any transgender ones. And that appears to me to answer the whole question of why there are so many transgender athletes. There's no advantage to being a transgender horse rider, so there are no transgender horse riders. Odd that, isn't it? It seems to me that the men who identify as female and then take prizes in female athletics really aren't men. No, they're just a bunch of bullies who feel empowered by humiliating women, and they've found a legal way to do it. There's that guy in Canada, isn't there? Forgotten his name. Another way, of course, is to go into women's lavatories and terrorise them there. Or, as I said, that chap in Canada who tried to demand that women give him a wax around his private parts, which were, and still are, very definitely male. At this point, I have to make it clear that I used to have a friend. She moved away and we lost touch, but she was transgender. She went through the whole process. And if anyone wants to be a woman that much, then she's very welcome to it. But she never took advantage of her superior strength in unfair competition with other women. It isn't people like her that I'm talking about. But the sort of men who remain men while insisting they're women are doing what they're doing because they're pursuing an agenda against women. Because we all know that a man, even with testosterone blockers, who has grown up a man is going to be heavier boned, taller, and with more muscle to fat ratio than women. That was something that the Chevalier knew about, and strangely enough, that made him a true gentleman. If you want to donate or contact, the information will be rolling over the Graniopteryx as I speak. Please like, subscribe and share because it does help with the algorithm. If you visit my channel on YouTube and one day discover that I've disappeared without warning, you'll still find me on BitChute or Minds. Just go to either of those platforms and do a search for Graniopteryx. If you're already watching this on BitChute or Minds, good for you. Meanwhile, if you're watching this on YouTube, remember that you must keep checking the subscribe and bell icons because occasionally they reset. Till next time.